We'll be talking about China in this portion of the program, and certainly the focus will begin with the coronavirus, but that's hardly the only place to go as we talk with Dean Cheng, Senior Research Fellow in Asian Studies at the Asian Studies Center of the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation, online at heritage.org. And Dean, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with something that you wrote along with several others here, including other former guests on this program, Jim Carafano, Assessing Beijing's Power, a Blueprint for U.S. Response to China over the next few decades. What are the central points that you make in this article?
The key points we're trying to get across to readers is that China is a fundamentally different challenge for the United States than any other country we've had to deal with before. They're not the Soviet Union, they're not Nazi Germany, they're not Imperial Germany. They are coming out of a completely different tradition. Asia never had balance of power politics the way Europe did, so they have a very different idea of the norm for international relations. They are not a rule of law society the way Europe has been. Again, it is ruled by law, so all the rules that are out there can and should be manipulated from Beijing's perspective. And finally, there's no real civil society, as the lead-in commenter, pointed out. Even when it comes to medical research in the middle of a pandemic, the state, and more importantly, the Chinese Communist Party, has the absolute right to decide whether something should be published, something should be disseminated, because it's all going to be filtered through the lens of what is good for the party, and secondarily, what is good for China before we get to things like, does it matter to the rest of the planet?
Now, there came a period, of course, after the death of Mao Zedong, and China, let's not forget, had gone, they took over power in the late 40s in China, and they, at times, I suppose, put the Kremlin to shame in a lot of ways in terms of, shall we say, their virulent obsession with Marxism. And finally, they withdrew from that paranoid viewpoint, and this goes back to a considerable extent to Richard Nixon's overtures as president, to ping-pong diplomacy. There's a whole story you can look up about the era, and everybody thought, wow, we've opened up the world to this great nation, China, and they're no longer sitting back, hunkered in their bunker, and thinking great paranoid thoughts about the world. Let's welcome them. So here's your seat on the UN Security Council, and here's your membership in all these big world organizations. Here's the rule book. Sign on the dotted line, if you would, and everything will be hunky-dory. And now we sit back decades later, and we note the complete abandon with which the Chinese have, it seems to this layperson, violated virtually every agreement they ever made, be it protection of intellectual property, currency manipulation, grabbing national territory out of the open seas. You could spend a whole hour just enumerating the list. And it would seem to me that we are past the time when we can allow one set of rules for China and another set of rules for the rest of the world. And I have stated on this air, and I will repeat it now, that if that requires not just tariffs on China or even quotas on China, but an outright embargo of China, I don't really care. I mean, we can make our own brooms and a few other things as well. I'd like your candid thoughts about that, because I think I am not alone in being fed up with the notion that China can get away with this simply because we let them get away with this.
So I think that we need to sort of take a look at a number of the things that you just said. The first is, why did we open up to China at all? And the answer is because of the Cold War. Because we thought in the late 1960s and early 1970s we were going to lose to the Soviets. And here was this country of about 1 billion people on the Soviet eastern flank that was going to distract them. And it worked. That was the bargain. It wasn't to make them capitalist. It certainly wasn't to make them a democracy. It was come on in on our side and help bring down the Kremlin. After that, what we've basically had is a country that started at, despite being 1 billion people, it had a GDP that was, at the bottom of the world scale. It's kind of amazing to think how far they've come in 30 years. Now, there's no question, as you said, in the process, they have benefited by the rules, and now they're breaking the rules. The problem is that in the process of getting to where they are now, they have become the most important trading partner of just about every country on the planet. That's very different from the Soviets. The Soviets didn't trade with anyone. And you know what happens when you don't trade with people? You don't create interest groups. Nobody really shed too many tears by not trading with the Soviets because they didn't trade with them anyway. It's one thing to say, well, we can make our own brooms. But the reality is our farmers export soybeans to China. Our factories import parts from China. And while we could say, well, we could make it ourselves, one, that's going to take a lot of time. But second of all, how many of your listeners have more than one flat-screen TV? How many of them have more than one, set of furniture in various rooms, couches and sofas and the like?
Yeah,
they can afford
and they came from China
because of trade. Yeah, that's right.
And I don't care. I mean, I'll put it this way: I have no problem, at the very least, with dealing with China on a few non-essentials, and we can throw out brooms back in there. We can throw in color TVs for all I care. I have a serious problem with approaching trade from the standpoint of the comparative advantage in every single way. If that were the case, then clearly the Chinese would be the place to go to make our M1 tanks and our F-35 fighters, because they can do it so much more cheaply. Well, we aren't quite that stupid yet, but apparently we are on pharmaceuticals. What is it, 96% of them come from China? At the very least, we should be self-sufficient in things of great national strategic importance. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. But there's the rub, right? What is strategic importance? So how much are people paying right now for ibuprofen? And by the way, the last time I tried to get some at the pharmacy, they were already sold out. How much are people willing to pay for essentially commodities? Because that's what ibuprofen is. It's an important painkiller, but nobody makes much money on it because it's not like high-end prescription blood pressure medicines and things like that. So that's another part of the issue here. The Chinese are very good at making billions of something and making a quarter of a cent per pill. American factories, American labor forces, it's not a matter of quality. It's a matter of what they're willing to work for. And by the way, if you think that you're going to bring back ibuprofen plants and pay people $15 an hour minimum wage, man, I want to know the magic that box that you're going to put everything through.
I'm prepared to pay more for any number of things, and I'm just not prepared. Again, I'm not assuming that what I have suggested will come without some pain, but I feel a lot of pain now from the notion that the Chinese export unemployment to us every year, and I'm fed up with that. And I wonder, are you arguing that, gosh, it's just impractical, and so it's the way it has to be, one set of rules for China, one set of rules for the rest of us? Is that really the argument?
No. I think that with regards to commodities like ibuprofen and various low-end, low-skill products, the reality is that we can encourage companies to set up plants. They're probably just not going to be in the United States. They may be in Mexico. They may be in Indonesia. They may be in Malaysia.
Well, better those places than China.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the funny thing is that if we do persuade companies to build there, we're actually going to wind up with countries that are strong enough to then tell the Chinese to go take a hike, which is, the benefit there is actually a virtuous cycle. With regards to other really important things, microchips, computer programs, things like that, absolutely. I don't pretend to understand why it is that Google not only wants to set up research campuses in China, but is more prepared to work with China on a censored version of a search engine than they are with the United States government.